There is a quiet confusion happening right now that almost no one talks about honestly. Some people are told that being alone means something is wrong with them. Others are told that being alone means they are somehow more evolved, more aware, more independent than everyone else. Both stories are comforting, and both stories are incomplete, because loneliness and solitude are not identities. They are psychological stages. And staying in any stage for too long, even one that feels safe, changes the way the mind works. This is where most conversations about loneliness go wrong. They either shame it or glorify it. They treat it as a personality instead of what it actually is, an adaptation. The human mind adapts to whatever environment it lives in long enough. That includes isolation. At first, being alone can feel like relief. No expectations, no performances, no need to explain yourself. Your nervous system finally gets quiet. But adaptation is not the same thing as health. The brain doesn't ask whether something is good for you long term. It only asks one question. Does this reduce immediate pain, Berto? If the answer is yes, it learns the pattern. Over time, the mind begins to reorganize itself around that pattern. What started as a coping strategy slowly becomes a self-concept. And what becomes a self-concept eventually feels like who I am. This is how loneliness turns into identity without anyone noticing. Not because the person is broken, not because they are superior, but because the mind is efficient. And efficiency is not wisdom. There are people who stay alone because connection repeatedly hurt them. There are people who stay alone because solitude feels clearer than chaos. And there are people who stay alone long enough that the idea of re-entering relationships starts to feel threatening to the version of themselves they built to survive. This is the part that almost no one wants to say out loud. Sometimes staying alone is not strength. And sometimes seeking connection is not weakness. Sometimes both are fear, just wearing different masks. And until you understand that, every explanation you hear about loneliness will either flatter you or shame you. But it won't help you see clearly. Because the real question isn't, why don't I have people? The real question is, what did my mind learn about safety? And what did it cost me? Part 1. How isolation quietly rewires the mind. When the human mind goes too long without meaningful connection, something subtle begins to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, quietly. The brain is a prediction machine. It learns from repetition. And when social attempts repeatedly lead to disappointment, misunderstanding, or emotional cost, the brain updates its model of reality. It starts to predict that connection equals effort, risk, or loss. So it does what it was designed to do. It minimizes exposure. At first, this looks like discernment. You stop explaining yourself to people who don't listen. You stop engaging in conversations that feel empty. You stop chasing relationships that drain you. That part is healthy. But the brain doesn't know where to stop. Over time, it begins to generalize. What was once selective withdrawal becomes global avoidance. You don't just avoid shallow connection. You start avoiding unpredictability itself. And unpredictability is the core ingredient of real relationship. This is how isolation rewires perception. You begin to experience people not as potential connection, but as variables, sources of noise, possible disruptions to an internal equilibrium you worked hard to create. Your nervous system becomes finely tuned to self-regulation. You learn how to calm yourself, how to think through emotion instead of moving through it, how to maintain internal coherence without external feedback. Again, none of this is wrong, but it is incomplete. Because humans don't develop their sense of self in isolation. We refine it in contact. Without that contact, something strange happens to identity. Your thoughts become clearer, but also louder. Your values feel stable, but also untested. Your self-understanding deepens, but it stops being challenged. And slowly, without meaning to, your inner world starts to replace the outer one. This is where many people mistake adaptation for evolution. Clarity feels like completion. Calm feels like resolution, but calm achieved through avoidance is fragile. It only holds as long as nothing presses against it. The moment someone gets close enough to disrupt that equilibrium, emotionally, psychologically, relationally, the nervous system reacts not with curiosity, but with threat detection. Not because the other person is dangerous, but because the system you built depends on distance to function. This is why some people feel exhausted by social situations even when nothing bad happens. It's not introversion. It's not superiority. It's cognitive load. Your mind is tracking inconsistencies, filtering tone, managing exposure, protecting coherence. Connection stops being nourishment. It becomes interference. And here's the uncomfortable truth most narratives leave out. If solitude becomes the only place you feel regulated, it's no longer freedom. It's dependency. Just a quieter one. Not dependency on people, dependency on control. And control always has a cost. Part 2. The self-deception that feels like strength. There is a particular kind of story the mind tells when it has lived in isolation long enough. It says, I just don't need people. I think better alone. Most relationships aren't worth the effort. I'm more myself when no one is around. Sometimes these statements are true, but sometimes they are a cover story. Not a lie, a protection. Because there is a difference between choosing solitude and needing solitude to feel safe. The mind doesn't like to admit fear directly, so it reframes it as preference. It reframes withdrawal as discernment. It reframes avoidance as independence. And over time, this reframing hardens into identity. This is where both extremes fail to tell the truth. The comforting narrative says, you're alone because you're sensitive and deep. The glorifying narrative says, you're alone because you're evolved and independent. Both spare the ego. Neither ask the difficult question. That question is this: what part of me learned that closeness threatens my sense of self? Because closeness does something solitude cannot. It reflects you. And reflection is destabilizing when your identity was built in isolation. When no one is there to push back, misunderstand you, or see something in you that you don't yet see in yourself, your self-image stays coherent, but also untested. This is why some people unconsciously avoid relationships that could actually work. Not because they're toxic, not because the other person is shallow, but because real intimacy introduces friction. It challenges the internal narrative. It reveals blind spots. It requires negotiation instead of control. And control is what solitude gives you in abundance. You decide the rhythm. You decide the meaning. You decide when to engage and when to disappear. In that environment, the self feels clean. But life doesn't happen in clean environments. The longer someone stays protected from relational friction, the more threatening it feels when it finally appears. This is how people become emotionally capable but relationally rigid, insightful but guarded, self-aware but unreachable, calm but closed. And here's the part that almost no one wants to admit. Some people aren't afraid of being hurt. They're afraid of being changed. Because change threatens the version of the self that survived. And survival identities resist revision. They don't ask, is this still serving me? They ask, will this undo me? So the mind chooses distance, not because it's better, but because it's familiar. And familiarity feels like truth. Part 3. When solitude stops teaching and starts limiting. There is a moment that doesn't announce itself when solitude shifts from being useful to being limiting. No crisis, no breakdown. Just a subtle plateau. You stop feeling curious about people. Not hostile, just indifferent. Conversations begin to feel predictable. Not because everyone is shallow, but because you're no longer engaging deeply enough to be surprised. Your inner world stays rich, but it stops expanding. This is how stagnation hides. Behind competence. You're functioning. You're thinking clearly. You're not in pain the way you once were, so nothing feels urgent. But growth rarely announces itself through urgency. It announces itself through discomfort. And solitude removes most sources of discomfort. That's why it can quietly become a ceiling. The mind is relational by design, not socially dependent. Relational. Meaning is shaped in contact. Perspective is refined through contrast. Blind spots dissolve when they're reflected back to you by another consciousness. Without that reflection, the self stabilizes, but it also solidifies. This is why long-term isolation can create a strange contradiction. You understand yourself better than ever, but you understand the world and your place in it less and less. Your interpretations go unchallenged. Your assumptions remain intact. Your conclusions feel obvious because no one is there to question them. And slowly, certainty replaces curiosity. This is the moment many people mislabel as peace. But peace without movement is sedation. It feels calm because nothing is pressing against you. Nothing is asking more of you. Nothing is revealing where you still need to grow. The danger isn't that solitude makes you weak. The danger is that it convinces you you're finished. Finished learning. Finished changing. Finished risking. And the mind loves that story because it means safety. But safety and aliveness are not the same thing. The moment solitude stops challenging you, it stops being a teacher. It becomes a comfortable room with no doors. And the longer you stay in it, the harder it is to remember that you once wanted more than comfort. Part 4. The reframe, what loneliness and solitude actually are. To move forward, one distinction has to be made clearly. Without romance, without fear, without ego. Loneliness, solitude, and isolation are not the same thing. Loneliness is a signal. It's the mind registering a lack of meaningful contact. It's painful because it's meant to be noticed. Solitude is a tool. It creates space. It allows self-regulation, reflection, and clarity. In the right dose, it restores you. Isolation is a condition. It's what happens when solitude stops being a choice and becomes the only place your nervous system feels safe. Most confusion begins when these three collapse into one identity. When loneliness is denied, it turns into numbness. When solitude is glorified, it turns into avoidance. When isolation is normalized, it turns into stagnation. None of these means something is wrong with you. They mean something adapted. And adaptation is reversible. The mind did not build these patterns to imprison you. It built them to protect you. But protection is not the same as fulfillment. You can be regulated and still unfulfilled. You can be calm and still incomplete. You can be independent and still closed. This is the truth neither extreme wants to acknowledge. You do not heal by staying alone forever. And you do not heal by forcing yourself into connection. You heal by integration. Integration means this. You can be alone without shrinking. And you can be with others without disappearing. You can hold your inner coherence while allowing relational friction. You can tolerate misunderstanding without retreating into distance. You can let someone see you without needing to control the outcome. That is psychological strength, not detachment, not superiority, not self-sufficiency as armor. Strength is flexibility. And flexibility only develops where there is contact. This doesn't mean seeking crowds. It doesn't mean performing extroversion. It doesn't mean abandoning solitude. It means allowing relationship to become a mirror again instead of a threat. Because the self doesn't finish forming in isolation. It finishes forming in dialogue. Part 5. How integration actually begins without forcing change. Integration does not begin with confidence. It begins with tolerance. Tolerance for uncertainty. Tolerance for emotional friction. Tolerance for not knowing how something will turn out. Most people think they need to feel ready before they re-enter connection. But readiness is not a feeling. It's a capacity. And capacity grows through exposure. Not intensity, but consistency. Integration doesn't ask you to abandon solitude. It asks you to loosen your grip on control, to let someone see a version of you that isn't fully managed, to stay present a little longer when your instinct says to retreat, to allow minor misunderstandings without immediately rewriting your self-story. This is not about becoming more social. It's about becoming more permeable, because the self you built in isolation is coherent, but sealed. And sealed systems don't grow. At first, integration feels awkward, not painful, not dramatic, just unfamiliar. You may notice irritation where you expected connection, fatigue where you expected interest, a desire to withdraw even when nothing is actually wrong. That's not failure. That's the nervous system encountering novelty. For a long time, solitude was how it stayed regulated. Now regulation has to include another variable, another person. That takes time. Integration also requires something few people talk about honestly: grief. Grief for the version of yourself that survived alone, the one who adapted, the one who learned not to expect much, the one who became self-contained because there was no other option. You don't outgrow that version by rejecting it. You integrate it by thanking it, and then letting it rest. Because survival strategies are meant to be temporary. They're not meant to become permanent identities. The goal is not to prove that you don't need anyone, and it's not to prove that you're finally lovable. The goal is to become someone who doesn't disappear, either in isolation or in relationship. Someone who can stay. Conclusion: what this stage was really for. If you spent a long time alone, it doesn't mean you failed at connection. It means your mind learned how to survive without it. And survival deserves respect, not worship. This stage of your life was not a destination. It was preparation. Not preparation to stay separate. Preparation to enter connection without losing yourself. You were learning how to hear your own thoughts, how to regulate your own emotions, how to exist without constant reflection. Those skills matter, but they were never meant to replace relationship. They were meant to support it. The mistake is believing that because solitude taught you something, it must be where you belong forever. Growth doesn't work that way. Each stage gives you what the next one requires. At some point, staying alone stops being wisdom and starts being avoidance. Not because you're weak, but because you're capable of more. And the world doesn't need you isolated. It needs you integrated. Not louder, not more agreeable, not more available. Just present, present enough to be changed, present enough to be seen, present enough to let your inner world meet another without collapsing or dominating. You don't need many people. You don't need constant connection. You don't need to perform closeness. You need one thing: the ability to remain yourself in contact. That's the real work. That's the real independence. And that's something solitude alone can never finish. If you're in this stage right now, there's nothing wrong with you. But there is more ahead of you. And you don't have to rush toward it. You just have to stop convincing yourself that staying where you are is the same as becoming who you're meant to be.